She hit me the first time because I smiled at the wrong moment. She hit me the second time because I stopped smiling altogether. Both happened in front of 63 people who had driven from 4 different states to celebrate her, and not one of them said a word. Not one person set down their champagne glass. Not one colleague from the 31 years she'd spent building her career stood up and told her to stop. They just watched. And I stood there in the middle of the Hargrove Ballroom in Crestwood Falls, Ohio, with my left cheek burning and my right cheek burning, and a room full of witnesses who had suddenly discovered the ceiling was very interesting. My name is Liora. I'm 24 years old. And the 2 slaps my mother Rochelle landed on me that night were the most expensive mistakes she ever made. She just didn't know it yet. Before I go any further, if this kind of story speaks to you, the kind where someone finally stops being small so that someone else can feel large, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribed. It genuinely helps, and I promise every story I bring you is worth staying for. Let me take you back to the Saturday in September when my mother retired from Callaway and Hines Financial Group after 31 years as their Senior Director of Client Relations. Rochelle Voss did not retire quietly. Rochelle Voss did not do anything quietly. She had been planning this party for 8 months. 8 months of venue calls, catering tastings, floral consultations, and a custom-printed photo display that cost more than my first month's rent. The Hargrove Ballroom was booked on a Saturday evening, which meant the premium rate. The menu was a 4-course plated dinner with a dessert station and an open bar that ran until 10. The invitations were letterpress on cream cardstock. I know this because I addressed 63 of them by hand at Rochelle's kitchen table on a Tuesday night in July while she stood behind me correcting my penmanship. I had driven 4 hours from Columbus to be there. Not because Rochelle asked me warmly. She sent me a text that said, "The party is the 14th. You're expected." That was the entire message. No question mark. No please. Just the date and the word expected, which in Rochelle's vocabulary functioned less like an invitation and more like a summons. I want to be honest with you about something before I describe that night, because this story doesn't make sense without the background. Rochelle and I have never been close. I don't mean we had occasional disagreements or went through a rough patch when I was a teenager. I mean we have never, not once in 24 years, had the kind of relationship where she called me just to hear my voice. What we had was a hierarchy. Rochelle at the top. Me somewhere near the bottom, usually beneath her expectations and occasionally beneath her notice entirely, except when she needed something addressed by hand or carried in from the car or explained away to someone who'd noticed she seemed cold. My brother Devin had the other kind of relationship with her. Devin was 30, broad-shouldered, worked in finance like she did, laughed at her jokes, and had never once in his life been told his posture was embarrassing her. Devin got the birthday calls. Devin got the Sunday dinners. Devin got the apartment down payment that Rochelle called a gift and referenced at every family gathering for 3 years afterward. I got the summons on the 14th. I arrived at the Hargrove Ballroom at 5:30, 30 minutes before doors opened, because Rochelle had texted at 4:47 saying the centerpieces looked uneven and I needed to fix them before guests arrived. I want you to picture the ballroom the way I walked into it. Ivory linens. Low candles in mercury glass holders. A string quartet in the corner running through their warm-up scales. A photo display along the east wall showing 31 years of Rochelle's career, every milestone framed in matching gold, her face sharp and confident in every single image. It was beautiful. She had built something real and the room reflected that, and I want to be clear about that because Rochelle Voss was genuinely accomplished. What she was not was kind, and those two things had been living inside the same person my entire life, and I had spent 24 years trying to figure out which one was the real her. I straightened 4 centerpieces. 2 of them were already straight. I didn't say that. I just straightened them and stepped back and waited for her to arrive. Rochelle came in at 6:15 in a champagne-colored dress she'd had altered twice, her silver hair set in a low chignon, a single strand of pearls at her throat. She looked extraordinary. I told her so. She looked at me, looked at my dress, a deep green wrap dress I had bought specifically for this occasion, and said in the tone she reserved for things that disappointed her without surprising her, "I told you not to wear green. It pulls attention." I had not been told not to wear green. I had received no instructions about what to wear at all. But this was not the night to say that, so I nodded and moved toward the bar to help the catering staff organize the glassware, which was also not my job, but standing still at a Rochelle Voss event without a task felt like standing in the middle of a highway. Guests arrived steadily from 6:30 onward. Colleagues from Callaway and Hines, some of whom had worked under Rochelle for a decade. Friends from her tennis club. Neighbors from the Whitmore Estates neighborhood where she'd lived for the past 12 years. Devon arrived at 6:45 with his girlfriend Priya, and Rochelle lit up the way she always did when Devon walked into a room, both arms out, full embrace, a laugh that carried across the ballroom. She held onto his arm for the first 20 minutes of the evening like an accessory she was proud of. I carried trays. Not because I was asked. Because it was easier to be useful than to be invisible, and at a Rochelle Voss event, those were the only two options available to me. Dinner was served at 7:30. Speeches began at 8:15. Devon gave a toast that made people cry, the kind where someone says something so true about a person that the room feels it collectively. He talked about her drive, her precision, her refusal to accept mediocrity. He talked about how she had built her career from a junior analyst position at 26 to senior director without ever once asking anyone to make room for her. People stood. Rochelle pressed her fingers to her mouth and looked genuinely moved, and for a moment, watching her from the back of the room, I felt something I hadn't expected. I felt proud of her. Whatever else she was, she had worked for what she had. Nobody handed Rochelle Voss anything. And then it was my turn. I had prepared remarks. 2 minutes, typed and rehearsed, folded in my clutch. I walked to the front of the room and I smiled at her and I said, 31 years is a long time to be the most formidable person in any room you enter. I meant it as a compliment. I had constructed it as a compliment. The room laughed warmly because they heard it as a compliment. Rochelle did not hear it as a compliment. I saw it in her face before I saw it in her hand, the way the warmth drained out of her expression and was replaced by something flat and certain. She stood from her chair and crossed the 3 feet between us and she slapped me once across the left cheek. Open palm. Sharp sound. The string quartet stopped mid-phrase. I didn't move. I stood at the front of that room with 63 people watching and I did not move because every nerve in my body had gone completely still the way nerves do when the thing that just happened is too large to process in real time. Someone near the back made a sound, not a word, just a sound, the involuntary noise a person makes when they witness something they cannot immediately categorize as real. You think this is funny, Rochelle said. Her voice was low and controlled the way it always was when she was most dangerous. 31 years and you stand up here and make a joke. I started to speak. I said her name, just her name, Rochelle, one word, and she hit me again. Same cheek. Same sound. The second one was harder than the first. I looked at Devon. He was looking at his plate. Priya was looking at Devon. The room had gone the specific kind of quiet that only happens when something crosses a line so far that no social script exists for it, when the usual mechanisms of polite recovery simply do not apply. A woman near the window, someone I didn't recognize, one of the tennis club friends, stood up halfway and then sat back down like she'd thought better of it. I picked up my clutch from the podium. I walked to the coat check. I got my jacket. And I walked out of the Hargrove ballroom into the September night air with 2 handprints on my face and 63 witnesses behind me who had chosen the ceiling over the truth. I did not know, standing on that sidewalk outside the Hargrove ballroom with my cheeks still burning and the September air cold against it, that the envelope sitting in the glove compartment of my car was about to change everything. I didn't know that in 7 days, a lawyer I had never met would call my number and the first word out of his mouth would be please. I didn't know any of that yet. All I knew was that I was done. I sat in my car for 40 minutes before I started the engine. Not because I was crying. I want to be clear about that. I was not crying. I was doing something I had never done before in relation to Rochelle Voss, which was thinking without flinching. Just sitting in the dark of the Hargrove ballroom parking lot with the engine off and the September cold already seeping through the windows, running through the last 24 years of my life the way you run your tongue over a broken tooth. Slowly. Deliberately. Mapping the damage. The envelope was in my glove compartment. It had been there for 11 days. I hadn't opened it yet because I hadn't been ready, and I know that sounds strange to carry something unopened for 11 days. But if you have ever received a piece of mail that you knew on some cellular level was going to rearrange things, you understand the particular discipline of leaving it alone until you are prepared for what rearranged looks like. I wasn't prepared yet. But I was getting there. Let me tell you about the envelope. 3 weeks before the retirement party, I had driven back to Crestwood Falls not for a visit but because Rochelle had asked me to clear out the last of my storage boxes from the basement of the house on Fenwick Drive, the house I'd grown up in, the one she was finally putting on the market now that retirement was official and she'd decided to downsize. She wanted the basement cleared before the real estate photographer came on a Thursday. So I drove 4 hours, loaded 7 boxes into my trunk, drove 4 hours back and didn't stay for dinner because she didn't offer and I didn't ask. The boxes were mostly what you'd expect. Yearbooks. A lacrosse stick from junior year. A shoebox of photographs I didn't remember taking. Old textbooks I should have donated years ago. But at the bottom of the last box, underneath a rolled-up poster from a college dorm room and a stack of birthday cards I had saved because even Rochelle's cards were better than nothing, there was a manila envelope I didn't recognize. Cream-colored, slightly water-stained at one corner, sealed with the kind of metal clasp that nobody uses anymore. In the top left corner, printed on a label that had started to peel at one edge, was the name of a law firm. Alderman and Cross, Attorneys at Law, Columbus, Ohio. And in the center of the envelope, handwritten in blue ink in handwriting that was not Rochelle's and not mine, was a single name. Just my name. Nothing else. I put it in my glove compartment and I drove home and I did not open it for 11 days because something in me understood that whatever was inside that envelope existed outside of Rochelle's management, and I needed to be in the right state of mind to receive it. Now sitting in the parking lot with 2 fresh handprints on my face, I reached over and opened the glove compartment. I held the envelope in my lap for a moment. Then I pulled the clasp open and took out the documents. There were 3 of them. The first was a letter, 2 pages, typed on Alderman and Cross letterhead, dated 14 months ago, addressed to me at my Columbus apartment. I had never received it, which meant it had been sent to Rochelle's address instead, which meant Rochelle had received it, and Rochelle had put it in a box in the basement, and either she had forgotten it was there or she had decided that was a clean enough way to make it disappear. I didn't know which yet. But first I read the letter. It was from an attorney named Holt Greer, a partner at Alderman and Cross. It informed me that a man named Wallace Pemberton of Dayton, Ohio, had passed away 16 months prior, and that I was named as a beneficiary in his will. Not a minor beneficiary. The primary beneficiary. Wallace Pemberton had left me his estate, which included a paid-off property in the Oakmere district of Dayton, a brokerage account and a sum held in trust. When I read the number I read it again because the first time felt like a misprint. It was not a misprint. The second document was a certified copy of the relevant section of Wallace Pemberton's will, with my full legal name typed clearly in the clause designating me as his sole heir. The third document was a handwritten note on plain white paper, 3 sentences in the same blue ink as the name on the envelope. It said, "Liora, I hope this reaches you before it reaches her. Your father asked me to make sure you knew. I'm sorry it took this long." I sat with those 3 documents in my lap in a dark parking lot in Crestwood Falls and I thought about the word father. My entire life, Rochelle had told me one version of that story. My father was a man named Carl DeWitt who had left before I was 2, who had expressed no interest in being found, who existed in my history the way a footnote exists in a book, technically present but not load-bearing. She had said his name exactly 4 times in my life, always in the same tone she used for things beneath discussion. Carl DeWitt. Gone. End of story. Wallace Pemberton was not a name I had ever heard. But someone had written your father in blue ink on plain white paper, and that someone had also written I hope this reaches you before it reaches her, which meant they knew about Rochelle, and they knew about the distance between what Rochelle received and what I was allowed to know. I drove to the Holiday Inn Express off Route 9 because 4 hours back to Columbus at 11 at night with my hands shaking was not something I was going to attempt. I checked in, sat on the edge of the bed and read all 3 documents 4 more times. Then I took out my phone and searched for Wallace Pemberton, Dayton, Ohio. What came up first was an obituary from the Dayton Daily News, 16 months old. Wallace Pemberton, 67, retired civil engineer, lifelong resident of the Oakmere district. Survived by no immediate family. The obituary was short, the kind written when there is no one left to write a long one, but there was a photograph. A man with gray at his temples and a wide, straight mouth and dark eyes set slightly wide in his face. I looked at that photograph for a long time. I looked at it the way you look at something you are trying not to recognize because recognition would require you to reconfigure everything you thought you knew about yourself. I have my mother's coloring, same olive skin, same dark hair, and I have always been told that. But the eyes in that photograph were the same shape as mine. The same slight downward tilt at the outer corners. The same distance between them. I am not a person who believes in signs or symbols. I work in data analytics and I believe in evidence. But I sat in that hotel room and I felt something shift in my chest that was not grief exactly and not anger exactly but something older than both, something that had been waiting a very long time for a reason to move. The next morning I called Alderman and Cross from the hotel parking lot. I got a voicemail. I left my name and number and said I had received the letter 14 months late and needed to speak with Holt Greer as soon as possible. Then I drove back to Columbus without stopping at Rochelle's house, without texting Devon, without calling anyone. I drove straight home and sat at my kitchen table and made a list of everything I knew and everything I didn't know yet, and the second list was much longer than the first. What I knew was this. A man named Wallace Pemberton had died and left me everything he had. A letter informing me of this had been sent to Rochelle's address, which could have been an administrative error or something Rochelle engineered, and I did not yet know which. Someone connected to Wallace Pemberton had written your father and had hoped the letter would reach me before it reached her. And Rochelle had slapped me twice the same night I finally opened what she had apparently buried in a basement box. Monday morning Holt Greer called me before I called him. His voice was careful and measured, the voice of a man who had been waiting a long time for a conversation he wasn't sure he'd get to have. Miss Voss, he said, I'm very glad you called. There's quite a bit we need to discuss and some of it is going to be difficult to hear. I told him I'd read all 3 documents. I told him I was ready. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, good, because your mother's attorney called our office 6 times last month, and what he was asking us to do is the reason I need you to understand exactly what you're entitled to before anyone else gets to it first. I wrote down every word he said after that. Every single word. He told me that Rochelle's attorney, a man named Stafford Pruitt, had contacted Alderman and Cross claiming I was not the intended beneficiary, that Wallace Pemberton had been suffering from cognitive decline when the will was drafted, and that the estate should pass to Rochelle as my legal guardian of record, a designation that had not applied to me since I turned 18. Holt had refused. Pruitt called again asking whether there was flexibility in their position. Holt said no. The calls after that, Holt told me, stopped sounding like legal arguments. They started sounding like a negotiation, which was another word for begging when the person doing it had no ground left to stand on. I asked how long Rochelle had known. He said, based on the mail forwarding records, at least 14 months. I did that math quietly. 14 months she had known, said nothing, and 2 weeks ago she had handed me a box of my own belongings and watched me load it into my car while that envelope sat at the bottom of it. Holt Greer's office was on the 14th floor of a glass building off High Street in Columbus, the kind of office where the furniture is expensive but understated and the view does most of the talking. I sat across from him 2 days after his phone call and he was not what I expected. I think I had been bracing for the version of a lawyer that Rochelle would have hired, polished and performative, the kind who enters a room like he's already won something. Holt Greer was none of that. He was in his early 60s, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, a yellow legal pad in front of him covered in handwriting so small it looked like it had been written for a different size of world. He stood when I came in and shook my hand and said, I want you to know I've been hoping to have this conversation for over a year. He laid everything out the way a careful person lays out something fragile. Wallace Pemberton had been his client for 19 years. Not a wealthy man in the way people use that word carelessly, but a man who had lived carefully, owned his home outright, invested modestly and consistently, and accumulated something that added up to considerably more than it looked like from the outside. Wallace had come to Holt and asked him to draft a new will. The previous will had left everything to a veterans organization. The new will named me as his sole heir. Holt had ordered a cognitive assessment from a licensed neuropsychologist, knowing a will leaving everything to a young woman the testator had never publicly claimed would get challenged. The assessment came back clean. Wallace Pemberton was sharp, oriented, and entirely competent to direct his own affairs. So I asked Holt the question I had been holding since the parking lot. Why hadn't Wallace ever contacted me directly? Holt was quiet for a moment. He took his glasses off his forehead and set them on the table. Then he said he tried. Twice. Both times through intermediaries because he didn't feel he had the right to walk into your life without warning after staying out of it for so long. The first attempt was through a mutual acquaintance who lost touch with Rochelle before the message could be passed. The second attempt, Holt said carefully, was the letter. The one addressed to your apartment but sent, through an administrative error on our part that I take full responsibility for, to your mother's address on file. I let that sit for a moment. An administrative error. One wrong address in a database and 14 months of my life had been redirected without my knowledge. I asked Holt what he thought Rochelle had done when she received it. He said he didn't think. He knew. Because Stafford Pruitt had contacted Alderman and Cross within 6 weeks of that letter being delivered, armed with specific details about the estate that Pruitt could only have known if someone had read the contents of a letter addressed to someone else. Let me tell you about Stafford Pruitt because you need to understand who he was before you understand what he tried to do. Pruitt had been Rochelle's personal attorney for 11 years, handling her estate planning, her property transactions, every negotiation she had needed someone sharp to run. He was meticulous, well-connected in Franklin County legal circles, and had the confidence of a man who had spent a decade winning on behalf of someone skilled at framing things in her favor. When he called Alderman and Cross the first time, he presented a coherent case. Wallace had shown cognitive decline. The will was drafted under undue influence. I had no documented relationship with the deceased. The estate, Pruitt argued, should revert to Rochelle as my parent of record until a proper review could be conducted. Holt had listened to all of it and then asked Pruitt one question. Could he provide the name of the neuropsychologist who had assessed Wallace Pemberton as cognitively impaired? Pruitt said he would follow up with documentation. He never did. Because there was no documentation. Because Wallace Pemberton had not been impaired. Because Holt had his own neuropsychological assessment sitting in a file and it said the opposite of everything Pruitt was claiming. What Pruitt had was Rochelle's word and 11 years of practice getting people to accept Rochelle's word as sufficient. What he did not have was evidence. The calls continued anyway because Rochelle is not a person who accepts the first no or the second or the sixth. She is a person who treats refusal as a negotiating position rather than a conclusion. And she had apparently decided that if she could not invalidate the will through legal argument, she would try to wear Holt Greer down through persistence. It hadn't worked. But it had told me something important. The fact that Pruitt was still calling 14 months after the letter was delivered meant Rochelle had not found another way around it. She was not holding some card I didn't know about. She was pushing on a door that wouldn't open and hoping the friction would eventually become unbearable enough that someone would just let her through. The door had not opened. And now I was on the other side of it. There was a second document in Holt's file that he had not mentioned on the phone. He slid it across the desk now with the deliberateness of someone who has thought carefully about the order in which to present things. It was a personal letter handwritten for pages from Wallace Pemberton to me, dated 8 months before his death. Holt said Wallace had left it with specific instructions that it be delivered to me personally in his office with Holt present. Not mailed. Not forwarded. Given by hand to no one but me. I will not read you every word of that letter because some of it belongs only to me. But I will tell you what it contained because the shape of it matters. Wallace wrote that he had known Rochelle before I was born, that they had been together in the way two people are when they are young and unprepared for what they are building. When Rochelle told him she was pregnant, he had wanted to stay. Plainly, without hedging. Rochelle had told him that was not what she wanted. Precise about it the way she was precise about everything, and he had respected that because he was 28 and believed that respecting a decision meant disappearing when asked. He had not understood then that respecting a decision and accepting it as permanent were two different things. He had thought about me every year. He had driven through Columbus twice, once when I was 7 and once when I was 16, not to intrude but because sometimes the need to know a person is alive is strong enough that proximity feels like enough. He had never gotten out of the car. He had watched from a distance and driven home to Dayton and told himself that was sufficient, that Rochelle had built something and he had no right to dismantle it just because the distance had grown difficult to carry. Then he got sick. And something about the specific clarity that illness brings had made the old agreement feel less like a boundary and more like a mistake. He had contacted Holt Greer. He had updated his will. He had tried through the letter to reach me before he was gone. He had not made it. But he had tried. That was the word I kept coming back to. He had tried. I read the letter twice in Holt's office and then I folded it and put it in my bag and looked out the window at the high street traffic below for a long time without speaking. Holt did not rush me. He sat quietly with his legal pad and let the room be what it needed to be, which was the particular kind of still that only comes when something that has been in motion for a very long time finally stops. There is a version of this story where I walked out of that office angry, where the grief curdled immediately into something harder and I turned it all outward toward Rochelle, toward the 14 months, toward every Sunday dinner I'd driven 4 hours to attend and left feeling like a guest who had overstayed. I understand that version. I have felt the edges of it. But what I actually felt sitting in that office on the 14th floor with Wallace Pemberton's 4 pages in my bag was something quieter and more complicated than anger. I felt robbed, yes. But I also felt for the first time in 24 years, like the math of my life had finally added up to something true. Like the equation had always been waiting for the missing variable. I asked Holt what happened next. He said the estate was ready to transfer the moment I provided the required documentation and signed the acceptance forms. The property in Oakmere. The brokerage account. The trust. All of it waiting, held in legal suspension for 14 months, for me to walk through the right door at the right time. He said there was one more thing I needed to know before we moved forward. Something Stafford Pruitt had said on the last call, the one Holt had described on the phone as closer to a negotiation than a legal argument. I asked him what Pruitt had said. Holt folded his hands on the desk and told me that Pruitt had suggested on Rochelle's behalf that I might be willing to split the estate. That if I agreed to transfer a portion of the inherited assets to Rochelle directly, she would cease her legal challenges and we could resolve the matter privately without further proceedings. Holt had declined on my behalf and then called me the next morning. I sat with that for a moment. Rochelle had slapped me twice in a ballroom on a Saturday night, and by the following Friday her lawyer was calling to ask for a share of a dead man's estate that she had spent 14 months trying to make sure I never found out about. I asked Holt what my options were. He said all of them. The thing about having all of your options is that you have to decide what to do with them. And deciding what to do when you have been raised by someone who made every decision for you, who treated your preferences as inconveniences and your questions as challenges to her authority, is not as straightforward as it sounds. I left Holt Greer's office with a folder of documents under my arm and stood on the sidewalk outside his building on High Street and felt, for a full 2 minutes, completely paralyzed. Not because I didn't know what I wanted. I knew exactly what I wanted. I was paralyzed because for 24 years I had wanted things quietly, privately, in the way you want things when you have learned that wanting too loudly gets managed back into silence. And now no one was managing me. And the quiet was enormous. I called Devon that evening. I had been thinking about whether to call him since the parking lot, running the calculation the way I always ran it with Devon, which was to ask myself how much of what I said would make it back to Rochelle before I was ready for her to have it. Devon loved me. I believed that. But Devon had spent 30 years in Rochelle's orbit and absorbed her gravitational pull in ways he probably couldn't see from the inside. He had looked at his plate when she hit me, and I needed to know if that meant he agreed with her or was simply afraid of her. There was a difference. He picked up on the second ring and I could hear the particular quality of his silence when I told him what I knew, the silence of a man processing information that was reorganizing things he thought were settled. When I finished he didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, Liora, I didn't know about any of it. I believe him. I want to be clear that I believe him. Devon is not a strategist. He is a person who follows the path of least resistance and calls it loyalty, which is its own kind of problem, but it is not the same problem as deliberate deception. He didn't know about Wallace Pemberton. He didn't know about the will or the letter or the 14 months of Stafford Pruitt calling Holt Greer's office. What he knew was that Rochelle had always referred to my father as a man who left, and he had accepted that version the same way he accepted most of Rochelle's versions, because she delivered them with such certainty that questioning them felt like accusing her of something, and nobody in our family had ever been comfortable with that. He asked me what I was going to do. I told him I wasn't sure yet, which was only partially true. I had a clearer idea than I was sharing, but I needed to think without Devon accidentally narrating it back to Rochelle. What I told him instead was that I needed him to understand something. I told him about the slap. The first one. He had been in the room, but I told him the version he hadn't seen from his seat. The version where I was at a podium with a 2-minute speech I had spent a week revising and Rochelle crossed the floor before I finished my second sentence. I told him about the second one. I told him what it felt like to look at him and see him looking at his plate. Not to wound him. Because he needed to understand there are 2 ways to be in a room when something wrong happens, and he had chosen the one that stays longer than the slap itself. Devon was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was lower than it had been at the start of the call. He said, I should have stood up. I know I should have. He stopped. I know, I said. I do know. But I need you to understand that knowing you should have and not doing it is a decision too, even if it doesn't feel like one in the moment. He said he understood. Think he did. Or at least as much as a person can understand something they are still in the middle of. I did not tell Devon about my next step before I took it. That was deliberate. 2 days after my meeting with Holt Greer, I drove to Dayton. To the Oakmere district, to the address listed on the estate documents. The house was a brick ranch on a quiet street with a large oak tree in the front yard that had clearly been there longer than the house. The lawn had been maintained by the estate executor since Wallace's death. The flower beds along the front walk were overgrown in the way things go overgrown when the person who tended them is no longer there, but you could see what they had been. Someone had planted them with intention. Symmetrically, in rows, the kind of planting that takes a weekend and a plan. I had a key from Holt. I stood on the front porch for a few minutes before I used it. The September air had gone cooler overnight and the street was quiet in the way mid-morning residential streets are quiet. Everyone already somewhere else. I put the key in the lock and the door opened, and the first thing I noticed was that it smelled like old paper and cedar and something underneath both of those. Something warmer that I couldn't name precisely but recognized the way you recognize a song you learned before you were old enough to understand the words. The house was furnished. Wallace had lived in it until his final months, when he moved to a care facility 2 miles away. Most of his things were still there. The furniture, the books, the photographs on the walls, all of it where he had left it. I walked through each room slowly, not looking for anything specific, just looking. In the small study off the hallway there was a desk with a reading lamp and an inbox tray holding a few pieces of unopened mail. On the shelf above, engineering textbooks, a few paperback novels with broken spines, and at the end of the row, wedged between a dictionary and a thin volume on Ohio civil history, a photograph in a plain wooden frame. I took it off the shelf. It was a photograph of a woman and a young girl, taken outdoors somewhere with a lot of light. The woman was dark-haired, standing behind the girl with both hands on her shoulders, and they were both squinting slightly into the sun and both smiling the same smile, the kind that leans slightly asymmetrically to the left. The girl was maybe 4 or 5. I looked at that photograph for a long time. Then I turned it over. On the back, in blue ink in the same handwriting as the note in the envelope, 2 words and a year. Crestwood Falls. The year was the year I turned 5. I sat down on the floor of that study with my back against the desk and I held that photograph and I let the full weight of 24 years settle onto me all at once. Not the manageable version of it, not the version I had been carrying in careful increments since the parking lot. All of it. The dinners where I drove 4 hours and ate quickly and drove 4 hours back. The birthday calls that came 2 days late if they came at all. The green dress and the uneven centerpieces and the 2 slaps and 63 witnesses who found the ceiling more interesting than the truth. The letter sitting in a basement box for 14 months. The man who drove through Columbus twice and never got out of the car. All of it landed at once and I sat on the floor of a dead man's study in Dayton and felt it without managing it back into something smaller, which was the first time I had done that in as long as I could remember. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for the light through the study window to shift. When I stood I put the photograph in my bag, which felt right the way it feels to take something that had always belonged to you and had simply been stored in the wrong place. Then I locked the front door and sat in my car in the driveway. Rochelle called while I was sitting there. I watched her name through 2 full rings and sent it to voicemail. A minute later a text arrived. "Laura, I think we should talk." The calibrated tone. The one she used when the direct approach had failed and she needed to try something measured. I had grown up with that tone and I knew what it meant. Not that she wanted to understand. That she had assessed the situation and decided a conversation on her terms was more advantageous than the alternative. I put my phone face down and started the engine. There was one more thing I needed before I was ready to face Rochelle at all. I needed to know exactly what she knew and exactly when. Not the outline. The specific timeline, documented and verifiable, the kind that doesn't shift depending on how she decides to frame it. I called Holt from the car and asked him one question. The answer was worse than I expected, which is saying something given where my expectations had already landed. It was worse because it meant the decision Rochelle had made was not reactive. Not a panicked response to an unexpected letter. It was a deliberate, considered choice sustained over 14 months, through 6 calls from her attorney, and still active as of the retirement party. As of both slaps. She had known the entire time. And she had hit me anyway. I put the car in reverse and pulled out of the driveway of my father's house and drove back toward Columbus with the photograph in my bag and a clarity in my chest that felt nothing like peace and everything like preparation. I did not call Rochelle back. I did not respond to the text. What I did instead was spend 3 days building something I had never built before in relation to her, which was a position she could not talk me out of. Every conversation I had ever had with Rochelle that involved conflict had ended the same way, with her reframing the situation until my version of events felt unstable and her version felt like common sense, and me walking away wondering if I had misunderstood something that had seemed perfectly clear going in. She was extraordinarily good at that. It was, if I'm being honest about it, one of the most impressive things about her. The ability to enter a disagreement and exit it having never once conceded a single point while making the other person feel that the conversation had been generous and fair. I had spent 24 years losing arguments I had been right about because I kept bringing feelings to fights that required documentation. This time I had documentation. Holt had given me the full timeline. The letter from Alderman and Cross had been delivered to the house on Fenwick Drive on a Tuesday in July, 14 months ago. Rochelle had signed for it. There was a delivery confirmation with her signature. 6 weeks later, Stafford Pruitt placed his first call to Alderman and Cross. Between those 2 dates, Rochelle had seen me 3 times. Once at a family dinner in August where she had complained about the traffic on I-71 and asked me whether I was seeing anyone. Once at Devon's birthday in September where she had told me my haircut was too severe for my face shape. Once at Thanksgiving where she had asked me to bring a side dish, critiqued the side dish when I arrived and served it anyway. Not once, across 3 separate occasions spanning 6 weeks, had she mentioned a letter addressed to me that had arrived at her house, or a man named Wallace Pemberton, or the word father. I want you to sit with that for a moment. 14 months of ordinary interactions, holidays, dinners, small frictionless contact that accumulates into the texture of a family relationship, and underneath all of it, held completely still, this thing she knew and had decided I would not. Holt had also confirmed that Pruitt's attempts to challenge the will had no legal standing. Ohio probate law was not on Rochelle's side. The cognitive assessment was clean, the will properly executed, the chain of custody documented. Pruitt had been throwing arguments at a wall for 14 months hoping one would stick. None had. The only thing left in Rochelle's toolkit was me. Whether she could reach me directly and convince me to agree voluntarily to something she could not compel legally. That was what the text was. That was what we should talk meant. She had run out of other moves. I called Stafford Pruitt. Not Rochelle. That choice was deliberate. Calling Rochelle would have meant entering her territory on her terms, and I had done that for 24 years and I was finished. Calling Pruitt meant conducting this as the business transaction she had always treated our relationship as, which felt like the most honest thing I could do. He answered on the 3rd ring and the half-second pause told me he hadn't expected it to be me. He recovered smoothly. "Miss Voss," he said. "I'm glad you reached out." I told him I was calling because I understood he had concerns about the Wallace Pemberton estate and I wanted to give him the chance to present them directly. He said yes, that Rochelle believed there were grounds for a formal challenge. I asked what grounds. He listed them. Cognitive impairment. Undue influence. Lack of established relationship. I let him finish. Then I told him Holt had a neuropsychological assessment establishing full competency, a 19-year attorney-client history documenting consistent estate planning, and a certified will naming me without ambiguity. Any challenge Rochelle filed would be opposed, documented, and expensive, and the likelihood of success was, in my non-legal but informed assessment, close to 0. He was quiet. Then he said there may be room for a negotiated resolution. Is it? I know. That's why I called you instead of my own attorney. But I want you to understand something first. I have the delivery confirmation with Rochelle's signature. I have the date. I have your call logs to Alderman and Cross. And I have 14 months of interactions that occurred after she received a letter addressed to me and chose not to mention it. I am not coming to a negotiated resolution because I am uncertain. I am coming because I want to give her one opportunity to handle this without a civil filing. But Pruitt's voice shifted in the way voices shift when a conversation has moved somewhere unintended. He said he would convey my position. I said please do and hung up. Devon called that evening. He had spoken to Rochelle. I could hear it in the first word, my name, said the way people say your name when they are delivering something on behalf of someone else and are not comfortable being the mechanism. He wants to meet, he said. Just the 2 of you. No lawyers. I said I'd think about it. He said he thought I should hear her out. I said I had been hearing her out for 24 years. He didn't have an answer for that. I met Rochelle 10 days later. Not at her condo, not at a restaurant she chose, not anywhere that was hers. I picked a coffee shop on North 4th Street in Columbus I had been going to for 2 years. I arrived first, ordered, sat at the corner table by the window and waited. She came in 12 minutes late, which was not an accident. Rochelle was never accidentally late. Dark trousers, silk blouse, the pearl studs from the retirement party. She looked, as she almost always looked, like someone in control of the situation. She sat across from me without ordering anything, which meant she had decided this was going to be short and on her terms. I had decided it was going to be as long as it needed to be on mine. She started talking before she had fully settled into the chair. The version she presented was not a confession. It was a construction. She had received the letter, yes. She hadn't known what to do with it. She had been figuring out how to bring it to me at the right time. She had been protecting me from a disruption she wasn't certain was in my interest. The retirement party had been emotional and she had reacted badly and she regretted it. He wanted us to move forward. She said the word family 4 times in the first 2 minutes. I counted. I let her finish. I did not interrupt. I did not argue with any individual point because arguing with individual points was how she won, by pulling you into the details until you forgot the shape of the whole thing. When she stopped, I looked at her for a moment and then I said, I'm not going to debate your version of events with you. I have the delivery confirmation and I have the date and I have 14 months of Stafford Pruitt calling Holt Greer's office. So I'm not here to argue about what you knew or when. I'm here to tell you that I've accepted the estate. All of it. Holt is processing the transfer. I'm not negotiating a split and I'm not withdrawing from the proceedings. I paused. What I am doing is giving you the chance to end this without a civil filing, because I think that is more than you gave me and I'm choosing to do it anyway. Something moved across her face that I had never seen on it before. Not remorse exactly. Rochelle is not built for remorse in the uncomplicated way. But something that recognized, maybe for the first time, that she was not the most prepared person at this table. He said, so that's it. I said, that's it. She straightened the already straight sleeve of her silk blouse. He said, I did what I thought was right for you. I said, I know you believe that. He said, you're my daughter. I said, I know that too. And then I picked up my coffee and I drank it and I looked out the window at North 4th Street and I let the silence be what it was, which was the end of something that had been pretending to be something else for a very long time. I live in Columbus still, though not for much longer. The estate transfer finalized 6 weeks after that conversation. The property in Oakmere is mine. I have been to Dayton 4 times since the day I sat on the study floor. The flower beds along the front walk are no longer overgrown. I planted them again in October symmetrically in rows. I have a photograph on my desk now, a woman and a small girl squinting into the sun, both smiling the same way. I go to therapy every other week and am learning slowly the difference between being guarded and being protected, because they feel identical from the inside but produce entirely different lives. Devin and I still talk. It is easier between us now that the thing neither of us was naming is named. Rochelle and I do not talk. That is not a door I have locked. It is a door I have left exactly where it is while I figure out who I am on the other side of everything that happened. Some mornings I sit on the porch of the brick ranch house in Oakmere and drink coffee and watch the street come alive and think about a man who drove through Columbus twice and never got out of the car. I do not think about it with bitterness. I think about it the way you think about weather. It was what it was. The sky is different now. I did not pick the family I was given. I am picking the life I am building. That is enough. That is, it turns out, everything. 18 months. That is the time jump. That is how far I am sitting from everything I just told you, and I want to be honest with you about what 18 months actually looks like from the inside, because I think the stories we tell about recovery tend to skip the middle part. The part where nothing is dramatic and nothing is resolved and you are just a person trying to figure out how to be in a life that is genuinely, structurally different from the one you had before. I'm going to tell you that part. Because I think you deserve the version that is true rather than the version that is tidy. I moved to Dayton in March. Not a dramatic decision, just the logical conclusion of smaller decisions that had been pointing in the same direction for months. The Oakmere house was mine. 4 rooms, a study full of books I had not yet read, a porch with a view of the oak tree, flower beds I had planted in October and watched come up in April the way things come up when you put them in the ground yourself. My Columbus lease ended in February. The math was simple even when the feelings were not. I want to tell you about the first morning I woke up in the Oakmere house as a permanent resident. It was a Tuesday in early March, still cold enough for condensation on the windows, and I lay in bed for a few minutes before getting up, without the alarm, without the immediate mental inventory I had spent years running. Just lying there in the quiet of a house that was mine. I made coffee and sat at the desk where Wallace had sat for 19 years and looked at the engineering textbooks and the photograph of the woman and the small girl squinting into the sun, and I felt something I had been feeling in increasing increments but had not yet trusted enough to name. I felt at home. Not in the sentimental way people use that phrase. In the physical way, the way your body settles into a space that belongs to it. The way a room stops being a room you are occupying and starts being one that knows you are there. The legal matters closed 4 months after the coffee shop. The estate transfer finalized without further challenge. Stafford Pruitt filed nothing. Whatever he said to Rochelle, she made the calculation I had given her the opportunity to make, that contesting was going to cost more than conceding in every way that mattered to her. The house on Fenwick Drive sold in November. Devon told me. I received it the way you receive information about people you are no longer in active contact with, as a data point rather than a weight. Rochelle and I have not spoken since the coffee shop. I want to be precise about what that means and what it does not mean. It does not mean I am angry. The anger was real and I am not going to pretend otherwise, but anger has a natural duration when you stop feeding it, and I stopped feeding it somewhere around month 4, when I was sitting on the porch in Oakmere on a warm evening in late spring and realized I had gone the entire day without thinking about her once. Not suppressing it. Not avoiding it. Just genuinely elsewhere in my mind. That was the first day I understood that the opposite of being controlled by someone is not hating them. It is simply not organizing your interior life around them anymore. Rochelle Voss had occupied the center of my psychological landscape for 24 years, and at some point in the spring without announcement she moved to the periphery. She is still there. I expect she always will be. But she is no longer the thing I am navigating around. Devon came to Dayton in May. First visit. He drove down on a Saturday morning and I made breakfast, eggs and toast and coffee, and we sat at the kitchen table and had the first conversation I can remember having with my brother that did not have Rochelle in it somewhere, as subject or subtext or gravitational field. He stood in the doorway of the study for a long moment and then came back to the kitchen and picked up his coffee and said, "I'm glad you found it." Meaning the envelope. Meaning all of it. Is it me too? We didn't need more words than that. The good news about Devon is that he is not a complicated person. The complicated thing was always the situation he was in, and now that the situation has changed, the person underneath it turns out to be someone I genuinely like spending time with. We have dinner over the phone on the first Sunday of every month. It is not a grand gesture. It is just a thing we do, and the consistency of small things, I have learned, is its own kind of love. I finished my first semester of classes at Sinclair College in December. 2 courses, an introduction to urban planning and a writing seminar, because I am 25 and I have a house and a life to build, and I am doing it in the order that makes sense for me rather than the order that looks impressive from the outside. The writing seminar was the one that mattered. The professor, a woman named Dr. Adiz Over, had a way of asking questions about the work that forced you to locate the true thing inside what you had written and then say it more plainly. She asked me once, after reading a piece I had submitted about the Oakmere house, "What is the thing you are actually writing about here?" I said I thought I was writing about inheritance. She said, "You are writing about permission. Permission to take up the space that was always yours." I have thought about that sentence almost every day since she said it. I have been learning, in the 18 months since the retirement party, what it feels like to give yourself permission. Permission to want things without immediately calculating whether the wanting is justified. Permission to take up space in a room without making yourself smaller to accommodate someone else's comfort. Permission to say no to things framed as obligations but which are actually just someone else's preferences wrapped in the language of duty. These are not complicated lessons in the abstract. They are extraordinarily difficult in practice when you have spent 2 decades being trained out of them. I'm still learning. Some days I do it well. Some days I catch myself shrinking out of old habit and have to make the conscious choice to stop. That is also part of the true version of this story. It does not end with full resolution. It ends with ongoing practice. There is one more thing I want to tell you. In September, on a Tuesday afternoon, I drove to the care facility where Wallace had spent his final months. Not for any practical reason. Just because I had been thinking about the fact that he had spent those months knowing the letter had been sent, not knowing if it had arrived, not knowing if I would ever walk through the door he was trying to open from his end. I wanted to see the place he had looked out from during that time. What I actually felt sitting in the parking lot on an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon, was gratitude. Not uncomplicated gratitude, not the kind without grief attached, but the real kind, the kind that acknowledges what was lost and chooses to be grateful for what remained. He had tried. He had written a 4-page letter and made sure his attorney knew to put it in my hands personally, and he had done all of that not knowing if it would work. He had tried anyway. I have decided that trying anyway without guarantee, without certainty of outcome, is the thing I most want to carry forward. Not the house, not the legal outcome, not the clarity of the coffee shop conversation. The trying anyway. The decision to reach toward someone even when you cannot control whether the reach lands. I planted more in the flower beds this spring. Perennials this time, the kind that come back the following year without being replanted. What I like about them is the quality of commitment they represent. You put them in the ground once and they come back. Not because you tend them every day. Because you made one good decision in the right season and trusted the ground to do the rest. I'm trying to live that way. One good decision at a time. Trusting the ground. My name is Liora. I am 25 years old. I live in a brick ranch house in Dayton, Ohio with a porch and an oak tree and flower beds that come back every spring. I know who I am. I know where I came from. And for the first time in my life, I know exactly where I am going. If this story made you feel something, don't just scroll away. There are so many stories out there that never get told, and here on Confira Stories we bring them to life. So if you enjoy emotional, real-life drama like this, take a second to subscribe and be part of the journey. And if you've ever been in a situation like this, or have a story of your own, share it in the comments. I read them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.